Thank you so much, Amoda, for talking with both of us today.
My pleasure.
We're really glad to have you here. And we are resisting our temptation to keep you hostage in an interview for a month because we both we wanted to go, when we were figuring out how to tackle, a conversation with you, we were saying, could we go paragraph by paragraph through the entire book? Do you think that's an option? So we will not do that. But just for those listening, I want to convey that's how much really juiciness was in your book for us. So, which we're very grateful for. And obviously we can't, harness that all here, but we're grateful to have a chance to have a conversation at all. And I would like to start with, all that said, kind of a giant question rather, and it's something we usually save for the end, but here at Bliss and Grit, our main focus is how do we maintain the bridge that exists in reality between our spiritual lives and our human lives. We talk about them as one and the same, as do you, but out there, a lot of people don't. And in your book, you point a lot to being fully awake and fully human. So I know it's an enormous question, but how would you define being fully awake and being fully human?
Yes, that is an enormous question.
It'll at least get us going somewhere for the whole topic.
That's why we probably need the month.
Right, exactly. Paragraph by paragraph.
That very question. Let's begin somewhere. What does it mean to be fully awake and fully human? Well, first of all, they're not in opposition to each other, and it's not about balancing both. That's very often the idea that comes up, is that we can be spiritual and follow that as a path or as a practice, but also fully embrace our human lives, and somehow the two are balanced. Yeah. It's really not about balance. It's about collapsing the whole dichotomy or duality between the two. And I guess the primary thing is to be aware of spiritual bypassing, this wonderful phrase that's now being spoken about more and more, coming into consciousness in spirituality more and more. Spiritual bypassing essentially being using spirituality as a way of avoiding the pain or challenge or bittersweetness of the human experience. And that's primary. And it's amazing in the conversations that I have with people how insidious this belief is. It might not be at the forefront, but in the back, very often it creeps in that somehow following a spiritual path or awakening is going to somehow negate the human experience or make it perfect or make me perfect, so that I don't have to experience anything that challenges me, that triggers me, that touches me deeply. So that's the first part of the conversation about what it means to be fully awake and fully human.
It's funny, we just did an episode last week on spiritual bypassing. So we are walking in step. And speaking of John Welwood, who was the original person to coin the term, I remember when I first started studying with John Welwood, for those of you who don't know John, he has a background in Buddhism and in psychology. So he had shared that the Buddhists would say that the state of the awakened heart had a term that they called sad joy, all one word. And that if you were really awake, there would be this bittersweet quality that you referred to, where you'd at once be aware that there is suffering, there is decay, there is death and loss, and that everything is so beautiful and so precious and so sacred. And I remember, I don't know, I must have been in my 20s when I started studying with John, and that striking me so hard, because there were other schools at the time that were saying, no, it'll just be bliss. You know, it's bliss.
Yeah.
And so even
That's
from
right.
then you saw that.
Yeah, that's right. And I know from my experience too, in the very early days, before awakening, I would really give myself a hard time if I wasn't feeling positive feelings. You know, that this glimpse of immense stillness, of immense vastness, of immense peace, which was so palpable, when it would swing the other way, which was very subtle, but there'd be some kind of unwanted feeling or unwanted thought, I would really beat myself up about that and fall from the spiritual pedestal. And so that pendulum would continue to swing. And it's only when I really saw that mechanism and stopped giving my attention to that that a deeper surrender happened. And it really is about surrender of any identification or attachment to how our experience is. And in that, something comes to rest. that subtle seeking mechanism that seeks to hold on to any kind of experience because it has an image of what a spiritual life looks like or feels like. And again, it's very subtle, that sneaks in. When all of that is surrendered, then we can really be with what is, with the reality of our experience, however raw, however broken, however, challenging, however terrifying. But somehow that all comes to rest in a deeper peace that accepts it all, accepts the whole breadth and depth of the human experience. But I will say also that very often when I speak about allowing our humanity and embracing the full depth and breadth of that, very often that's translated as an excuse to fall back into reactivity and the, if I may call it, the matrix of the human condition. So it's not about laziness. It's not about saying, well, you know, if I'm fully awake, I'm just going to accept whatever is, and that means I can be my human conditioned self, yeah? So that I'm, still giving myself to those narratives. It really is about fully waking up and then embracing our humanity.
I see.
Fully waking up out of the dream of separation and then embracing our humanity.
It's interesting. One of the questions that was coming up specifically for you, and I don't know why, because I don't think I've heard you speak about this, but is an exploration around gradual awakening versus spontaneous. And is there such a thing? Because it seems that when I listen to many teachers, there's kind of a moment, like a watershed moment where they wake up from the dream of separation. Yet my experience has been almost like more and more I'm seeing through that dream of separation. And I just wondered if you could share a bit, because it almost seems that the more I accepted my humanness, the more I had the spaciousness to realize truth. And so it seems like it could go on both sides of this equation. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it does. It's both. Mm-hmm. It's either it's both. It's gradual and subtle, or it's just gradual. It sort of weaves in and out of both. I know for some people it is gradual. For instance, with Kavi, my partner, my husband, it's been gradual. And there's been a full blooming, if you like, or flowering of that awakeness over time as certain reactive patterns or clouded vision or energetic obstructions have just gradually fallen away in the face of the openness of love ongoing as this relationship. So for him, it's been a gradual process. And then there comes a point where one can almost look back and see how that shift has happened. And then it becomes the full flowering of that. For me, it was gradual and then sudden. Yeah, so there was definitely a moment that came where there was a much deeper surrender, a much more complete surrender to the existential abyss in which the self was annihilated. It was very definite. I can't say it was sudden in the sense that nothing had happened before that. There was a path, a process, a journey before that was probably the ground of fertilization for that. But there was definitely a moment that really shifted everything much more completely and without having to weave in and out again.
Yeah.
However, after that, there's still a process. After that, there's still a process of the embodiment of it in the human life. And so that kind of relates to our original starting point in this conversation. What does it mean to be fully awake and fully human? There's a whole maturation process that happens after that, even after that moment of awakening, that isn't spoken about very often, if at all. I mean, maybe it is these days a little bit more. I think that conversation is beginning to come forward. But there's a whole maturation process of how that awakeness flows into and infuses every part of our lives, right down to the, bare bones of our relationship with everything. And that's not often spoken about. And so the reports of a sudden awakening, and then there's nothing to say after that, are somewhat misleading. That gives the impression that there is this sudden moment of awakening, and then after that, everything is bliss, or everything is perfect, or, I don't know, there's no more pain, there's no more challenge, there's no more, it's just transcendence of the human experience. It's just not spoken about, and that's where the juice is. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember a friend gave me a Zen book many years ago, and in the back there were the stories of people's awakening, and it had that very Zen approach where it was always every story. It was like, and then I woke up, and the story would end, and then I woke up, and then I got my enlightenment, and story end. And I remember finding it so frustrating, because at the time that I revisited the book myself and then a couple of other people I know, it seems like there's this ground to walk through, and I'm curious to hear you talk about this, where if you have a really profound realization or awakening, oftentimes there's this sort of fire hose of trauma that gets uncorked, where instead of like, and then I got my enlightenment and I felt great. I didn't feel fear, and I understood, like, you can see that and have that experience for a little bit. But it can get pretty gnarly if there are things that you have, I think for survival, turned away from. And I know that you have had experiences in your life. You've been through quite a lot of trauma, in this human life. So I'm curious what you think, and I don't want to equate that with what you're talking about, which is the maturing into awakening in a human life, because I think that's on the other side, not to make it too linear, of turning towards all the things that hadn't been turned towards before.
Okay, so I this, just going to that, to those stories of, and now I've awakened, now I've, yeah. Two things. One is that historically, those individuals, those beings that have awakened, whether it's from the Zen tradition or the Buddhist tradition or whichever tradition, historically, in those cultures and at that time, the likelihood, and I'm just positing this as a possibility, the likelihood is that they did not come from dysfunctional families, dysfunctional society in the same way that we do today.
Yeah.
The human psyche is perhaps more fractured today in the modern world than in previous generations. I don't mean the near generations, but the very far back generations. Certainly, society and culture was not perfect. It never is, but most likely there was less trauma, less addiction, less pollution in all ways, internal psychic pollution and physical pollution that gets passed down through generations. So that's why this conversation today is different. It's not about just waking up and that's it.
Yeah.
It is about then what do we do? How do we meet some of these traumas and dysfunctionalities that are deeply embedded energetically in our experience, which don't go away, they don't get wiped out. So that's one side. The other side, or the other factor, is that in those cultures, in those difficult times, most often that would be at least reported from a male perspective. And also, most probably, not always, from somebody who had renounced the world in some way, or was, living in a way that was not about the marketplace of life. And so that's a very different experience. That's why we're having this conversation, and that's why I wrote the book. It's what happens next in the ordinariness of life. So now I can't remember the other part of your question, Brooke, but it was...
Well, I was talking about, I'm kind of off on this other place because I'm curious to hear what you think about the feminine and how that is bringing in this different embodiment. And what I had been talking about before was this, that there seems to be this stage for people who have experienced trauma, which a lot of us, I would say most of us, have some very significant trauma, that there can be this stage where if, let's say, a lot of veils have been removed or a whole chunk got removed at a certain time, there can be a gnarly stage, we can call it dark night of the soul or what have you, but like where there's meeting, and I'll speak for myself, and I've talked about this on the show before, really intense physical sensations of disgust and shame and like hot burning on the inside and sweat, there's a lot of really intense energetic stuff. And I know I'm not alone. I'm fortunate to know a lot of people who are going through this process. So it helps me feel less crazy, and I get to do this work here. But I think it's important to talk about, because it's not just the like, oh, and now it's all just God and bliss and,
Yes. The process of awakening is very, there's no formula. Mm-hmm. There's no linearity to it. It's totally individual. So for each person, there are many factors involved. How much of that meeting of those shadow energies has already happened? That makes a difference to how then waking up out of the dream of separation is experienced and reported, and how it manifests in your life, what it looks like, what it feels like, and how it continues. So whether those shadow energies have been met as part of the journey of self-development, self-inquiry, self-growth, spiritual path, and so on, whether that's happened as part of your journey leading up to awakening, or whether that happens, or whether awakening happens as a glimpse, which is what it is, and then those shadow energies reveal themselves to start the purification process, whether it weaves in and out of those is totally individual. Yeah. When I say awakening, it gets tricky. Or at least initially, when I used the word awakening, I meant full awakening. I meant awakening when all of those shadow energies had been met, where the vessel was clear, where that capacity and willingness to meet everything without flinching. I'm not saying that everything was purified or is purified immediately. I'm just saying the willingness for that and the absolute surrender to that is so complete that there's actually not much left afterwards. It then flows into one's life. It pours in, and there's no weaving in and out of it anymore, which means there's very rarely any energetic symptoms. That's really what I mean by awakening. I've come to realize as time's gone on, and with speaking with more and more people, that awakening, the word awakening is used in many different ways, mostly as a glimpse of awakening. And when I say a glimpse of awakening, yes, a veil has dropped. And there can be many veils that drop. And then there are more energies, shadow energies that come forwards, and energetic symptoms, whether they're physical, emotional, mental, and that's part of the awakening journey or the awakening process. So I've come to realize that it's both a process and a journey for most people, but so we can use the word awakening to describe that process, a point to that process. But there is a place, and it's not a final destination, although it sounds like it, where one fully wakes up out of the dream of separation. And more importantly than that, the surrender is total. There is no more resistance. So you, as a self, are not an impediment to the full expression or manifestation of awakeness in the world.
And are you referring to like almost when the personal will is completely gone, meaning life can be moving through you, and that there's not this, that the separate self doesn't try to control or manipulate anymore?
Yes, that's part of it. And what I'm really saying is there is no more argument with life. There is no more argument with your experience. When
there should be happening, shouldn't be happening.
So when there's no more argument with your experience, even if that's a very intense physical symptom or an emotional experience, a feeling that's dark, unwanted, shame, regret, all of these things. Shame is a very strong one, very strong shadow. When there is no resistance to that, it goes very, very quickly. It's transformed very, very quickly. Yeah. If you surrender all the way, you'll come to, or what will be revealed in you, is the fear, the terror of personal annihilation. You come to what I call the existential abyss, beyond any personal effects, if you like, to do with shame and regret and discomfort and anger or sadness or grief. Beyond those, there's another place which is a universal existential edge, if you like, where the fear of non-existence can be fully met, or it reveals itself asking to be met. Because that's the final, if there is a final, it deepens after that, but that's the final knot, or the main knot of contraction, which has nothing to do with your story and your history and your personality and everything that goes with that, but has to do with the universal condition of humanity being born into form. When that's finally met, and that can only be really met when some of the other personal shadow energies have been met, then finally this one reveals itself. When this reveals itself, it's the fear of aloneness, that I exist alone in the totality of existence, and the willingness to surrender to that is the end of the self construct. After that, there's no more fear. After that, there's nothing to turn away from. Nothing. After that, there is only openness. It's like a merging with the totality. Then there's no impediment to whatever appears. So then old energetic patterns that become more subtle and more hidden can finally come to the forefront and be met in the everyday experience. But there's no more resistance to that. Then awakeness becomes very ordinary. It's no longer an experience. It's no longer a view. It's no longer anything that we can stand on. It's so ordinary that at that point you wonder if anything ever happened at all. At this point, at that point, if you openness is open. It sounds so simple, but it's so profound. It's just openness. There isn't anything obstructing the bare fact of the experience. It's not embellished. It's not manipulated. It's not upheld as anything. It's not embraced as anything. It's not rejected as anything. It's absolutely just this. When it's just this, the whole conversation, and we're in danger of collapsing the conversation, the whole conversation of spiritual and not spiritual, of awake and human, comes to an end. Comes to an end. That's what I mean. It's not, being fully awake and fully human is not a balance of two things. They're not, in the end, even that conversation comes to an end.
When I saw you in New York recently, an example of this that I thought that really struck me when you said it, you said, when somebody asks me, on one of our breaks or something, how are you enjoying New York? It's a totally irrelevant question. And like the way, when you said that at the moment, I was like, oh, yeah, but, I live my life in a way where I'm still in separation. So I get caught up in the, do I like this? Do I not like this? How's it going? How do I feel about this? What's my experience? And you were describing the seamlessness of everything.
Yes. What you're describing is the end of self-referencing. Mm-hmm. It's this end of me assimilating my experience and then reflecting to myself how that experience is and whether I put it in the box of like or dislike and so on. It's the end of that. So in that sense, that's the end of division, inner division. And we're saying the same thing in different ways now, or I'm saying the same thing in different ways. It is this openness, this ordinariness, this end of the duality between awake and human is the same as saying as the end of inner division. The end of inner division comes with that you're describing. It doesn't mean we walk around completely, without a mind. Of course, we use that mind when necessary, but we use the mind. The mind doesn't use us. And so experience, most of the time, unless it's absolutely necessary for completing a task, is just that. It's just experience, but it's not self-referenced experience. So yes, the question is, how are you enjoying New York? Is impossible to answer. Right. Impossible to answer because it's not being experienced in that place, which means that everything is alive. Everything. It's like getting off the subway and for the first time in New York, in Manhattan, and the fast pace and the trying to find our way to our hotel or wherever. Everything is alive. None of it is higher or lower than another experience, and then walking in Central Park or, being in satsang. None of it is compared with anything else. It's all really, really alive and right here and not categorized. And yet it's not detached. It's not cold. It's not bland. It's just fully vibrant. Everything is vibrant. So the answer to that question is everything is enjoyed, even when it's difficult. Even when I say difficult, maybe one needs to move fast, or there's, you don't know where you are, and I don't know.
Yeah. I'm loving this conversation, and I'm smiling the whole time. What's interesting about having conversations like these is how, A, words can be corrupted, right? So you have to really talk about, what do you mean by awakening? We can have so many projections. And B, how individual, A, the path is, but also where we're at and what we can hear and how we can relate to the material. So I know before I've had certain realizations, I may listen to what you were saying from this very far off place, like end of self-referencing? Impossible. But a couple of months back, I stopped experiencing this daily nagging shame that was with me for 40 years, and I never would have thought that was possible. So it can feel closer to me now.
Yeah.
But depending on where you're at, I imagine you can listen to this and think like, what? Right? How is this even imaginable that I can be without self-referencing? And then you can try to, act as if, etc. We know all the taboos because we have people listen to our shows and go, well, I heard you and Brooke say, so I figured I would. And I'm like, oh, wait, no, everyone's different. And the medicine can be different,
It
right?
wasn't a rule.
Right. That was for Brooke, but not for you. Yeah. Which is obviously
Absolutely.
the difficulty, right?
Yeah, it is. That's why very often, conversations where, you might ask me, what's your definition of this, or, anything, even just talking about it in any way, is never accurate. It's never really the truth. It's always going to be approached slightly differently. I mean, it's always pointing to the same thing, but the words that we use are really only in context of this conversation and this dynamic and this energetic relationship that's happening, which is why the only place that it's really useful is when somebody sits in front of me, if you like, and brings forwards what it is that they're struggling with or resisting, or that's painful, or that seems to be in the way of this deepest acceptance, this deepest openness, and create suffering. And then we can dialogue and fine tune and navigate very specifically and very individually. So it's not theoretical and it's not a bunch of concepts. And still we dance around words.
Sure. I think it's important. I mean, the more I've matured in my life, the more I recognize the power of having a relationship with a teacher. I mean, I've had multiple teachers. I don't think you have to dedicate your life to one. I mean, I know plenty of people have had a path without a teacher, but it is so profound because I guess if I could just speak to my own experience, sometimes you feel like you're going crazy. And because of the subtlety of all of this, it can be difficult to discern the stories I may be attaching to it. Am I trying to feel special? Do I think I'm disordered? Versus what's arising. For example, one of the delights of this show is Brooke and I have very different experiences. I mean, there's overlap, but they're very different. And we speak to teachers, and they have very different experiences. So if everything's individual, you think, well, how do I know I'm not going crazy when all of a sudden I'm meditating and my body starts to shake? Or when all of a sudden I have some realization and I'm laughing hysterically at the beauty of it all? How do I know I just haven't lost my mind? And I think a lot of people go through that. I mean, I think self-doubt, speaking of self-referencing, I mean, one of the common self-referencing patterns is, this can't be happening. Who am I to think this could be happening? What is this thing? I mean, we have spiritual self-referencing all over the place, right? So I think it is interesting for one to discern between what they may be creating in their mind, what they may be clinging to because they heard someone else talk about it, versus what is a direct experience that's genuinely arising and that needs to be met. Does that question even make sense? Because it's my inner world coming forward. Okay, good.
Yeah. I don't know if there was a question in that. I didn't hear a question, but I heard you describing some of the process of awakening. Yeah, when it is a process. So these questions come up, and these little hooks come up, the hooks of self-referencing in the spiritual experience. Very often, as you said, because we heard that before. Yeah. So then we're comparing our experience to what we heard. So is it the truth that I'm experiencing? Is it awakening? And, and so on and so forth. And a teacher, or whether that's a short-term teacher or a long-term teacher, is really there, hopefully, to reflect back where those little hooks remain, and to invite you to a deeper surrender of any self-referencing, any concept of what awakening is or isn't, so that you can be ruthlessly honest with your direct experience, which is all that matters. When you really just meet your experience as it is, without clinging to any idea that it means anything. It means I'm spiritual. It means I've arrived. It means I got it. It means I didn't get it. I got it and I lost it. When you're able to surrender all meaning, then something more abiding, more profound, more honest, more true can reveal itself. And that's tricky.
For sure. We have found that to be true.
Especially these days, as there's more and more information about awakening, there are more and more teachers, there are more and more books, there are more and more videos. So we're kind of influenced by that so much.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, one of the things I'm so grateful about your work is that you're reclaiming this totally corrupted word, enlightenment, and pointing right at it. And you're making it a normal part of a human experience. And yet at the same time, one of the other things that goes on with that, like you're saying, is that as we all bring this forward more and talk about it as a normal potential for a human life, and not just the super special people, you know, that we read about in texts or, you know, hang on our walls or whatever, there is also at the exact same time so much more potential for misunderstanding and bypass and all the things.
Yes, both of those.
Yeah.
Both of those, the whole messy paradox of it. So, yeah.
I guess all we can do is just keep pointing at it, but in a discerning way that brings people into their actual direct experience and living our own direct experience.
Conversations, we keep having the conversations and being honest with what comes up.
Mm-hmm.
Which is an interesting skill. I mean, sometimes when we talk about psychology, people have spoken about psychology and spirituality being antithetical, as they believe that psychology solidifies the self and spirituality is about lacking self-referencing, or, you know, I'm being overly simplistic. Yet my experience is there was a way that I learned how to tolerate honesty and develop some modicum of self-compassion that I was completely lacking, so that I can hold that experience. I didn't have that automatic defense. Like, I remember, for example, if I did something wrong, you know, I hurt someone's feelings, I didn't even want to apologize. I had so much shame in me that to even acknowledge what I did would threaten to overwhelm my system. And of course, now there's so much more freedom around it. I can say, oh my God, I'm so sorry. What are you going through? Because I don't have to take it personally, and I have the ability not to, I guess, flagellate myself over everything that goes wrong. So I feel like there is, though we, the ego, this self that I am most familiar with, can't, you know, create an awakening. We're not in control. I think there's something beautiful, even in your teachings, that's available for pre-awakening about developing the tenderness that you reference, that's so meaningful to me, the self-compassion, and sort of the tolerance to be honest about us being human. I mean, I was holding myself to really kind of inhuman standards, and what it means to be human. I mean, you wrote, as long as you have a body mind, you'll have an ego. Ah, how relieving, right? We don't have to try not to have an ego to be good or spiritual or, you know, of service to this world. And so I do believe that it's really wonderful to, even now, anyone listening, to begin to relate with tenderness and honesty more, so we can receive our direct experience.
Absolutely, yeah. It's the groundwork. It really is the groundwork. And, you know, being kind towards our own experience, being vigilant towards that tendency to make ourselves wrong, make somebody else wrong, or make the world wrong.
Yeah.
And rather than waiting for this lightning bolt of enlightenment, of awakening to come down and suddenly, I don't know, make you a perfect person, rather than waiting for that, the more beneficial, the more useful, the more true way is to start practicing that now, to start practicing that tenderness towards your own experience, tenderness towards the world, which is your experience. There isn't anything but your experience. And to put down all weapons of war. or weapons of war being the argument with what is. And what is not, excuse me, is not the circumstances. Most often people think that the acceptance of what is just putting up with the events or circumstances of one's life or of the world or of one's experience. I'm not talking about circumstances, I'm talking about one's experience of those circumstances. So if one is experiencing intense sadness or intense discomfort or intense uncertainty or intense grief, to be really, truly okay with that. It doesn't have to be any other way. To stop fighting that very experience. Because the fight with that, the non-acceptance of one's own experience, is a defense against having one's heart broken wide open by reality, by the earthly experience, which always has suffering in it. So putting down the weapons of war is the end of the argument with our own experience, which is the end of trying to have only a good experience. It's the end of having to be special or good or worthy. It's the end of inner division. And then you can live fully awake and fully ordinary, fully human. There's no obstruction to the full expression of life as it is.
That's such a helpful refinement, because I know in myself, and I wrestle with this a lot, and then I see people have questions about, well, they'll put people on the spiritual path in the box of the ones who are just checking out and saying it's okay, and I think that we're in a time in the United States. You moved here right before Trump was elected, right? So you got here just in time for the fun. So I'm sure you've seen a lot of us going through, this feeling of helplessness and rage and confusion and despair. And those of us who didn't want him to become president, obviously, there are quite a few who feel really celebratory. And so I think that with this renewal of activism, which is a really beautiful thing, but it's very intriguing because it's like, are we saying that people on a spiritual path are just resigned? Oh, well, just make it okay, which is not at all what you're saying. And then there's a way that we can still do our activism or with just creating more noise, right? Because we're not meeting our direct experience. We're not really turning towards the heartbreak. And so I guess, to refine it a little more, like what might that look like for people who are saying, oh, you're just saying to check out and be the spiritual person?
No, it's not about checking out.
Right.
It's about meeting what is without a perspective to stand on. Meeting what is without an opinion to stand on. However righteous that opinion is, however righteous that viewpoint is, however righteous we feel, self-righteous we feel about what's right and what's wrong, as long as that's driving the action, the activism, then it's perpetuating war. Inner war and outer war. It's perpetuating division. So it's tricky and it's subtle, but when we really are willing to see in ourselves when we can be really honest, ruthlessly self-honest about our self-righteousness, and then our willingness to put down, to surrender that self-righteousness, which is where the real call comes, because we really don't want to do that, especially when we really think we're right and they're wrong, and that we're doing the good thing and they're not. If we're really willing to put that down, even if there's a fear that it means that I'll become helpless, I'll become passive, I'll become uncaring. The challenge is to put down all self-righteousness, however much the narrative, the voice in the head says, but that means that you'll become a victim or helpless or uncaring, or the world will never be saved, and and so on and so forth. To actually put that down first and see what happens. Mm-hmm. When we put down our self-righteousness, it doesn't make us lazy. It doesn't make us passive. It means we see clearly. We see not from a place of me and my perspective, but we see from non-judgment, non-division, non-reactivity, and that gives space for intelligence, true intelligence, to come forwards, the intelligence of love, which then informs us either to take action or not take action. But it'll come from a different place, and it'll probably look different. Mm-hmm. It certainly will have more power. So another way of saying this, and I like to use this metaphor because it seems to speak to people, is be like a samurai warrior. Stand absolutely poised in stillness, in silence. Move silence, not from inner narrative of what's right and what's wrong, and be ruthlessly honest in that. And if you're not sure, then don't move. Mm-hmm. Stand as silence, saying stand as openness. And increasingly, that's all I speak about is openness. I no longer talk about awakening as such. I just talk about openness. An openness that has no division in it, no condition in it. So in that sense, it has no self in it. Stand. And at the right time, intelligence will inform you to either chop his head off or have your head chopped off. Either way, it's God.
To talk about dropping agendas is such an interesting thing. I mean, we did a whole episode on agendas, and I noticed you pointing towards things like that, how we relate to our world with agendas. We certainly show up in our intimate love affairs and in our careers and everything with agendas. And it's so common to us. And I think given that it's so common, maybe now is a good moment to bring the conversation towards tenderness. Because, Amoda, you said something that struck me as just so fascinating. It was in your second interview on Buddha at the Gas Pump. You were talking about the nervous system and how our nervous system over time can become encrusted to reactivity, right? To become more reactive and to create divided states. And we know our ego mind seems to be programmed to perceive a separate self. So there's all these things about being human that will make it samurai training to be able to stand there, in our stillness and openness. And I think for me over the last couple of years, and probably over my lifetime, it has always come back to love. I can't seem to have another answer arise for me. And you spoke so beautifully on tenderness. And how might one bring presence and tenderness, even to the parts of them that are self-righteous, the parts of them that are loaded with agenda and relationship, so that maybe the stillness maybe will arise more easily.
This thing of agendas is vital in the inquiry, in the conversation. It kind of hits the nail on the head, if you like, in terms of meeting reality, meeting the human experience as awakeness, as openness. Whenever we see or experience the agenda in what we do, and that's where the self-honesty comes in. Most people, most of the time, don't even know that, see that in themselves. It's totally taken for granted. That's called being in the matrix. That's lost in the matrix. Yeah?
Yes.
It's not reality. It's imagination. It's imagination in the sense that we are imagining our world. We're imagining the outcome, or the unwanted outcome or the wanted outcome, and then our actions, our behaviors, our response to life is driven by that. It's driven either by protecting ourselves, hiding, turning away from an unwanted outcome, or moving towards a wanted outcome in the hope of salvation. When we operate in that horizontal dimension, if you like, that horizontal way of operating, which is the matrix, we're lost. We're trapped. To break out of that is an ongoing process and journey, which requires, first of all, the willingness to be ruthlessly honest with oneself. Well, first of all, it requires just suffering to come to such a head that one wants to break out of it.
Yes.
And then the wanting to break out of it leads us to spirituality and the spiritual path and self-inquiry and so on. And then the journey of honesty can begin. And so can all the little traps and pitfalls. When we're somewhere along in the journey, when this has already started and these conversations and these self-inquiries have started, then it's an ongoing journey of seeing where that seeking mechanism, which is the expectation or the desire for an outcome, an agenda, an investment of one's action, whether that action is an external action or an inner action towards our feelings, towards our thoughts, towards each other in relationship, towards the world and what we see in that. When we have any expectation of an outcome, which is, it's the same thing as saying an investment of self. In other words, I need you to be a certain way, or to respond to me in a certain way, or I need you to like me, or I need you to love me, or anything. And whether that you is an individual you, or the in order for me to feel good about, in order for me to feel safe, in order for me to feel comfortable, in order for me to feel loved, in order for me to feel worthy, in order for me to feel special, and so on and so, in order for me to feel right, and so on and so forth. As long as when we start to see that mechanism, then we have the possibility to surrender that mechanism. Mm-hmm. Without seeing it first, there's no possibility lost in the matrix. Mm-hmm. So in every relationship that we have, when we start to see that it's based on need, which is codependency. And that codependent relationship is not just an intimate relationship, it's a relationship to the world. We have a need for the world to be a certain way in order to feel comfortable, in order to feel safe, in order to feel whatever it might be. Yeah. When we start to put down our need, which is really the same as righteousness, I'm right about my need. Yeah, we're attached. Yeah, we're identified with that need. And I find myself through the validation of that need. Yeah, I am good. I am okay. I am loved. I am held. I am worthy. I am special. I am good enough. I find myself in the validation of that need. When we're finally willing to put that down, then codependency transforms to love, real love. We start to live as love in our relationships, get love from anything or anyone. It's not a commodity, and it's not about I love you, or I love the world, or I love anything. It's not the love of anything. It has no subject or object. You are love. And you're not love because you do good things. You just are love. Whatever you do, inevitably they'll be good. Yeah, because harm doesn't come from that. But it hasn't got an agenda for anything. It hasn't got any self-referencing in it.
I feel like I just went on a very intense tour of what that feels like. So I'm just kind of metabolizing energetically. I'm like not super useful with words right now.
Yeah, that all
really
arose
beautiful.
from your thing about agenda. So, so then, that would be addressed on an individual level. I would invite people to come and be really honest about what their agenda is. When they tell me they're suffering or struggling about something, whether it's the world, which often comes up, and the political situation, the economic situation, the horror of the world, whether it's that or whether it's their personal relationships and there's a struggle in that, or with a son, with a daughter, or, with a parent, with their husband, with their wife, whatever it is, or with their work, whenever somebody comes and tells them about what they're struggling with, we dig deep into what the agenda is. Yeah.
Well, it's so interesting because, of course, I can track in my life, for example, holding grievances against my parents because they weren't what I needed them to be, right? Whoever this I is that needed a certain thing. And, we see it in love affairs all of the time, but they're not being the way I need them to be, and they're kind of locked in negotiation. Like, if I give you this, will you give me that? And, But what's also interesting is how we are with ourselves. I mean, we demand ourselves to be other than we are. We perceive that we need to be other than we are. And we can have the most agenda in this subtle place. For example, Brooke and I will speak a lot about, meeting the part of you, the contraction, like the wound, with tenderness, with warmth, with love, or even just meeting it, just touching it, if that's where you can begin. And what I'll see over and over again, even with listeners who then speak to me after, is they do it, but even as they do it, they're like, all right, listen, I'm going to meet you with love, but so
here's
when are you
the
going to
deal.
Stop, right?
Here's the agreement we have.
Right. I'm coming to you nicely, but quit it, right? So that's how embedded it can be in our human patterning and how common. And it seems to me such a great place to begin an inquiry is even how you show up in relationship to yourself.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That is often what happens, and especially on the spiritual path, the spiritual quest. If I surrender, or if I meet this, or if I, whatever it is, then will it all be okay?
Right. I actually have, I can't believe it, right in front of me, a quote, because my brain hasn't been working for all the questions we wrote in advance, but that speaks to this from your book, obviously. The acquisition of psychological and spiritual tools for fixing yourself and getting what you want in order to feel better about yourself is a huge error of attention. And we've been talking about that huge error of attention. And we've been talking about redirecting the attention, but I just wonder if we could maybe, go into that a little more, like what might be a deeper place to direct our awareness or our attention, as opposed to this, if I do this or get this, then I will feel better or finally be at home in the world, or whatever the thoughts are.
Yeah. So let's rephrase that in the sense that it's not really about redirecting your attention, but more about falling into the unknown. Mm-hmm. In the moment, or in the awareness that I'm giving my attention to the agenda, to what I need, to the accumulation of good feelings, good experiences, and so on, so that I can feel better about myself or feel good about myself. When that's been seen, when that's been, you get close to that, and then it's like, well, okay, so now what? What can I do instead? It's not so much where can my attention go. It's more that in that seeing.
If you all are listening, she showed a beautifully open hand.
I have no words for it. Yeah, I can put some words on it, yeah. But that's what surrender is. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the seeing of the agenda. When I say seeing, I mean it happens energetically. It's an energetic experience. You don't see it with your eyes. You feel it, and you don't feel it with your emotions. It's just an energetic experience. Whenever there's an agenda for an outcome, whenever there's need for self, if you become fine-tuned to it or sensitive to that, either through practice or because that starts to happen more and more because your honesty, your self-honesty has become priority in your life, and it starts to become the main operating system. Yeah. You feel, you sense, let's say, you taste the texture of a subtle contraction, a subtle resistance to the unknown unfoldment of life, because it's unknown. So the expectation and the agenda attempts to keep things known, to keep your experience known, which means that you have a safety net, the safety net of expectation, the safety net of hope for salvation. If I do this, then I'll get this, and then I'll feel good about myself, or whatever it is. Yeah, good enough. That's all a safety net. It's a mental safety net. When you see that and are willing to live without a safety net, then this subtle closure, this subtle resistance, this subtle contraction, this subtle argument with what is, because that's what it is, relaxes, and you start to live as the open hand that has no agenda, that has no expectation. And the closest we can get to describing it, it's like falling. It's a moment-to-moment falling into unknownness as openness. It's so innocent. It's so pure. It's so unencumbered by personal agenda, or any agenda. We don't even have to call it personal. Agenda, full stop. That it meets reality nakedly as it is, without self-referencing. Actually, very ordinary. It's like a baby. That's what a baby does. That's what a newborn does. That's the place they're in. That's what a kitten does. That's what a puppy does. Except we can, if you like, do it. I'm using the word doing rather clumsily. It's not a doing, but we can be it consciously. Yeah, a newborn is not conscious of that. A kitten is not conscious of that. We are conscious of that openness, not in a self-referencing way, but consciousness is aware of itself as that openness, and that makes all the difference.
Wow.
As you were talking, I was catching myself. I'm just going to out myself here because it's so funny and I don't think I'm alone, listening and going, oh yeah, after we finish this conversation, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go on a hike with no agenda and I'm going to just live as open. So I'm like, as you're describing it, I'm having agenda about the experience, the great experience I'm going to deliver to myself. After we're done,
agenda.
it's so
the
funny.
Agenda of no agenda.
To catch the right. And the way it layers it, oh, good. I'm going to go get it right in the woods in this very romantic way. After we get up, it's so funny though to see all those movements of it.
So go and do that in the woods. It's a great practice. Mm-hmm. And the reason that you're having that thought is because you actually know what it feels like. Mm-hmm. You know it. We all know it. It's our innocent state. It's who we already are as openness. Yeah. So then we it's almost like we're just remembering it, and you remember it when you're in nature. Yeah, it's much closer then. So by all means, do that, practice that, be that. And then be that as you're sitting here. Be that as everything takes place in the marketplace of life. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Be that openness then. That's where it
counts. That's the juice. Yeah. I know we have to wrap up. Boy, do we hope maybe we'll get a part 2. I mean, you all listening will just have to read her book for part 2 for now. Just listening to Amoda, I'm recognizing over the years, I am finally beginning to just have this natural love affair with the unknown arise. You know, it used to be so scary, and then you realize, actually, my self-concepts were a lot more painful than the unknown, right? So slowly but surely, some beauty is being found in this unknown, and I feel like if everyone listening can get that just from the energy of Amoda's teachings, like it's okay if it's not known. Wow.
Great. Yes, that's beautiful.
Thank you so much for coming on with us, Amoda. We have loved talking with you. I think I can speak for you on that, Brooke.
For sure. Thank you so much. We're so grateful.
Thank you both.
Thank you.